Towering megacities clawed at poisoned skies while billions huddled in the shadows of corporate spires, their lives measured not in years but in the dwindling credits that kept starvation at bay. The great economic collapse of 2122 had shattered the old world order, leaving humanity to feast on its own bones while the elite retreated behind walls of steel and plasma shields. In the sprawling undercity of New Shanghai, where neon signs flickered like dying stars and the air tasted of rust and desperation, a man named David Kowalski ran a soup kitchen that served hope one bowl at a time. David had once been someone else, a decorated officer in the Terran Defense Corps, a man who believed in duty and honor and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. That was before the Proxima incident, before he watched his entire squadron vaporized by weapons that shouldn't have existed, wielded by enemies that officially didn't exist. Before the military buried the truth so deep that even the survivors began to question their own memories. Now at 43, David's hands bore the calluses of honest labor instead of the steady grip of a plasma rifle. His weathered face carried lines earned through sleepless nights spent ladling soup for children who had never known a full belly. The military pension that should have been his lifeline had been administratively reviewed into non-existence, leaving him with nothing but his conscience and a stubborn refusal to let the innocent suffer for the sins of the powerful. The soup kitchen occupied the ground floor of a condemned apartment complex, its walls held together by prayer and cheap sealant. Every morning David would arrive at 0500 hours old habits died hard and begin the ritual that had kept him sane for the past 8 years. Check the protein synthesizers. Test the water purification systems. Inventory the meager supplies donated by those who had little but gave anyway. Today felt different. The sensation crept up his spine like cold fingers. A battlefield instinct that had kept him alive through 3 interplanetary campaigns. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. The first sign was the silence. The Undercity never slept, never quieted. Street vendors hawked synthetic meat that tasted like cardboard and promises. Gang forces conducted their business with the efficiency of corporate executives. Children played games with rules written in desperation and sealed in blood. But as David prepared the morning meal, a thin vegetable broth stretched to feed 100 hungry souls. The familiar symphony of urban decay had faded to a whisper. The second sign was the girls. They appeared at exactly 0647 hours, 2 pale wraiths who materialized from the fog-shrouded alleyways like ghosts given flesh. The older couldn't have been more than 12, her dark hair hanging in matted tangles around a face that bore the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had seen too much too young. The younger, perhaps 8, clung to her sister's hand with the desperate grip of a drowning swimmer. Their clothes were strange. Not the typical patchwork of scavenged fabric that dressed most undercity children, but garments of unfamiliar design. The material seemed to shimmer with an internal light, shifting between colors that had no names in human languages. Despite the grime and wear, the fabric appeared unmarked by the harsh chemicals that ate through most synthetic materials within days of exposure to the Undercity's toxic atmosphere. David had seen thousands of hungry children over the years. Each face told a story of abandonment, abuse, or simple bad luck. These two were different. Their eyes held depth that spoke of knowledge beyond their years, and when they looked at him, he felt as though they were reading the contents of his soul with the casual efficiency of scanning a datapad. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. The older girl nodded once. A single precise movement that somehow conveyed more than most people managed with an hour of conversation. David ladled soup into 2 bowls, real ceramic, not the disposable containers the city required for sanitary compliance. He added extra protein chunks, ignoring the voice in his head that calculated how many others would go without. The girls accepted the bowls with hands that trembled from more than cold, and for the first time in what might have been years they smiled. The older girl spoke, her voice carrying an accent that David couldn't place. "Thank you, David Kowalski." He hadn't told them his name. The skin between his shoulder blades began to itch, a warning signal that had kept him alive through 100 firefights. But the younger girl was eating with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten what food tasted like, and her sister watched with the protective desperation of a parent. "What are your names?" David asked. "I am called Lyrithus," the older girl replied, the syllables flowing like liquid music. "My sister is Nixandra." David nodded as though alien names were as common as rain in the Undercity. Where are your parents? Something flickered behind Laredis's eyes, pain perhaps, or something deeper and more complex. Gone, she said simply. We have no one. The words hit David like a plasma bolt to the chest. He knew that emptiness, that hollow ache of being truly alone in an indifferent universe. Without thinking, he pulled 2 more bowls from the cabinet and filled them with the last of the morning's soup. Eat, he said, both of you, as much as you want. For the next hour the girls consumed food with an efficiency that spoke of long hunger and longer desperation. They ate everything David could provide. Soup, synthetic bread, even the bitter reconstituted coffee that most adults found unpalatable. Through it all they watched him with eyes that seemed to catalog every movement, every expression, every word. Other children began arriving as the morning progressed, drawn by the promise of a warm meal and David's unshakable rule that no one left hungry if he could help it. But his attention kept drifting to the 2 strange girls who had appeared like visitors from another world, which, as it turned out, they were. The attack came at 30:47 hours. David was cleaning bowls in the kitchen's cramped back room when the building shook with the impact of something massive. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, the deep, bone-rattling tone reserved for threats beyond the normal scope of urban violence. Through the grimy window, he could see people running through the streets with the desperate panic of prey animals fleeing a predator. Then the sky began to burn. Massive shapes descended through the cloud layer, vessels that dwarfed the largest Terran battleships, their hulls gleaming with metals that seemed to drink in light and exhale shadow. They moved with the fluid grace of living creatures, defying everything humanity understood about physics and engineering. As they settled into position above the megacity, weapons ports opened like blossoming flowers, revealing energies that made the sun seem pale by comparison. David's military training kicked in with muscle memory efficiency. He herded the remaining children into the kitchen's reinforced storage room, a glorified closet that might provide protection against conventional weapons. The girls, Lyrithis and Nixandra, stood apart from the others, their strange clothes now glowing with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. What are they? David demanded, his voice cutting through the sounds of distant explosions. Lyrithis looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than her apparent age. The hegemony, she said. They have found us. The building shook again. Harder this time. Somewhere above them, David could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging for another strike. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential violence, every molecule vibrating with barely contained destruction. Found who? David pressed. But before Lyrithis could answer, the world exploded into light and sound and chaos. The blast wave hit the building like the fist of an angry god, collapsing 3 floors in an instant, and turning the air into a sandstorm of pulverized concrete. David felt himself lifted and thrown, his body slamming into the far wall with enough force to crack ribs. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear children screaming and the deep rumbling laughter of collapsing infrastructure. When his vision cleared, the storage room was gone. In its place, a gaping hole opened to the street below, where strange figures in flowing robes were ascending on platforms of crystalline energy. They moved with the fluid grace of dancers, but David's combat-trained eye recognized the precision of professional killers. The figures were not human. They stood 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in what might have been skin or might have been organic armor that shifted color with each movement. Their faces were angular, almost geometric in their perfection, with features that seemed designed by an artist who had never quite understood what made a face human. Most disturbing were their eyes, large, multifaceted organs that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. One of them spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in David's bones. The words were in no human language, but somehow he understood them anyway, as though the meaning bypassed his ears entirely and wrote itself directly into his brain. "Where are the inheritors?" the creature demanded. David looked around desperately. Most of the children had been thrown clear by the blast, landing in the relative safety of the building's main floor. They were bruised and terrified, but alive. The 2 girls, however, were nowhere to be seen. Another blast shook the building, and David realized with cold certainty that these creatures, these aliens, weren't interested in conquest or resources. They were hunting, looking for something specific. Looking for Lyrethis and Nixandra. The lead alien raised what might have been a weapon or might have been a scanning device. Energy crackled between its fingers as it swept the device across the rubble-strewn room. When its multifaceted gaze fell on David, he felt a pressure in his mind like ice water being poured directly into his skull. "You have seen them," the creature said, its words drilling into David's consciousness. "The ones we seek. Where have they gone?" David had faced torture before. Physical pain, psychological pressure, threats against everything he held dear. But this was different. This was a violation at the cellular level, a rewriting of his basic humanity. The creature was inside his head, sifting through his memories like files in a databank. And yet, somehow he resisted. Maybe it was the stubborn streak that had gotten him court-martialed for refusing to follow illegal orders. Maybe it was the simple human perversity that made his species refuse to yield even when facing impossible odds. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something about human consciousness that these aliens didn't understand. "Go to hell," David said through gritted teeth. The alien's head tilted with mechanical precision. "Curious," it said. "Your mind is resistant. Most species yield to neural scanning within seconds. Yet you maintain conscious barriers despite significant psychic pressure. Must be all those vegetables my mother made me eat," David replied. The alien's weapon began to glow with increasing intensity. David braced himself for death, or worse, when a voice spoke from the shadows. "Leave him alone, Vestarian." Lyrethis emerged from behind a fallen support beam, her strange clothing now blazing with light bright enough to cast hard shadows across the ruined room. She no longer looked like a 12-year-old human girl. The illusion had been cast aside like a discarded mask, revealing something that was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien. Her true form stood nearly 6 feet tall, despite her apparent youth. Her skin had the deep blue-black color of space between stars, marked with intricate patterns that shifted and flowed like living tattoos. Her hair was white as starlight, floating around her head as though gravity were a suggestion. But her eyes were the same as they had been when she was pretending to be human. Ancient, wise, infinitely sad. "Inheritor," the alien called Vestarian hissed. "You will return with us. The compact demands it." "The compact is broken," Lyrethis replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "It died when you chose genocide over growth." Nixandra appeared beside her sister, her own transformation equally dramatic. Where Lyrethis burned with cool starlight, the younger girl radiated warmth like a miniature sun. Her skin was golden, marked with patterns that seemed to contain entire galaxies in miniature. "The hegemony offers order," Vesicarian said. "Unity through submission, purpose through service. Your rebellion serves only chaos." "Our rebellion serves life," Lyrethis countered. "Something your species forgot long ago." The weapon in Vestarian's hand reached full charge, energy crackling between crystalline projectors with barely contained violence. Around him, the other aliens raised similar devices, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the destruction they were about to unleash. David understood, with the clarity that comes just before death, that he was witnessing something far beyond human comprehension. These weren't just aliens, they were representatives of civilizations that spanned galaxies. Beings who viewed entire worlds as pawns in games played across millennia. And somehow, 2 of the most powerful among them had chosen to appear as hungry children in his soup kitchen. "Why?" David asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Why pretend to be human children? Why come to me?" Lyrethis turned to him, and for a moment her alien features softened with something that might have been affection. "Because we needed to understand," she said. "We needed to see if there was something in your species worth preserving." "And?" David pressed. She smiled, and despite her alien appearance, it was the same smile she had given him when he offered her that first bowl of soup. "We found our answer." Kostefasarian's weapon discharged with the sound of reality tearing. The energy beam lanced across the room with enough force to vaporize a city block, but instead of striking Lyrethis, the beam struck an impossible barrier. A wall of pure light that absorbed the attack and reflected it harmlessly into space. David blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. The barrier wasn't coming from the alien girls, it was coming from him. His hands were glowing with the same inner light that marked the two inheritors. Energy flowed through his body like liquid fire, painful and exhilarating, and absolutely impossible. He was human. Baseline human. He had no genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements, no exotic technology grafted into his nervous system, and yet somehow he was holding back a weapon that could level mountains. Impossible, Vestarian hissed. Humans cannot channel the source. They lack the neural architecture, the genetic predisposition. They are, he paused, his multifaceted eyes widening with something that might have been fear. What have you done to him? Lyrithus and Nixander exchanged a look, a conversation conducted entirely in glances and subtle shifts of expression. When Lyrithus spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that made her sound almost human again. We did nothing, she said. This is natural, spontaneous evolution triggered by extreme emotional stress. He's protecting us not through alien technology, but through pure human will. The implications hit David like a physical blow. If he could do this, if humans could do this, then everything changed. The balance of power in the galaxy, the future of his species, the very nature of what it meant to be human. Vestarian raised his weapon again, but this time his movements carried the frantic desperation of someone who had just realized that all his assumptions were wrong. Kill them all, he commanded, his subordinates. If the humans are evolving, then they cannot be allowed to survive. The aliens opened fire with weapons that could crack planets. David felt the barriers around him strengthen in response, fed by a rage that seemed to draw power from the very foundations of the universe. These creatures had come to his world. They had threatened his people. They had tried to hurt two children who had done nothing more than ask for food. That was unacceptable. The energy barriers exploded outward with the force of a nuclear detonation, vaporizing the aliens' weapons and sending their wielders flying through the walls of the surrounding buildings. Vestarian crashed into a support pillar hard enough to crack the alien's organic armor, his multifaceted eyes dim with shock and pain. David took a step forward and the floor beneath his feet turned to glass from the heat radiating from his body. Another step and the air itself began to shimmer with barely contained power. You want to kill innocent children, David said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the building's remaining structure groan with sympathetic resonance. You want to threaten my species? You want to bring your war to my world? He reached down and hauled Vestarian to his feet with one hand, the alien's 7-foot frame suddenly seeming small and fragile against David's human fury. Then let me show you why humans don't make good victims. The last thing Vestarian saw before David hurled him through 3 city blocks was the smile on the human's face. It was the same smile David had worn when he served soup to hungry children. But now it promised something altogether different. The Hegemony War Council convened in the shadow of a dying star. The chamber itself was a testament to the Empire's reach, a crystalline sphere suspended in the vacuum between realities, its walls displaying tactical readouts from 1,000 conquered worlds. Holographic projections filled the space with the ghosts of civilizations that had dared resist the hegemony's vision of ordered perfection. Each light represented billions of lives snuffed out in the name of universal peace. High Admiral Zethkaran stood at the chamber's center, his form wreathed in the dark energy that marked his rank among the hegemony elite. Where lesser members of his species bore the blue-black skin that spoke of noble birth, Zethkaran's flesh had been transformed by centuries of exposure to the source, the fundamental force that powered their technology and bound their empire together. His skin was void black now marked with patterns that hurt to look at directly, each line a testament to power that could reshape reality with a thought. Around him, the surviving members of the Earth Assault Force knelt in positions of ritual submission. They bore the wounds of their encounter with the human plasma burns, shattered armor, the hollow-eyed stare of soldiers who had faced something beyond their comprehension and barely lived to report it. Vestarian, his geometric features marked by fresh scars, spoke in the harmonic language that had once unified a galaxy. The human designation David Kowalski displays source manipulation capabilities that exceed theoretical maximums for unaugmented consciousness. Conservative estimates place his power output at 14,000 standard units during the confrontation. A ripple of shock ran through the assembled officers. 14,000 standard units was enough energy to glass a continent. For a baseline human to channel such forces without technological assistance should have been physically impossible. Explain this impossibility, Zithkaran commanded, his voice carrying undertones that made the crystalline walls vibrate in sympathy. We believe, the Cytharian continued, that the inheritors have been conducting unauthorized experiments on the human population. Genetic manipulation designed to create source-capable variants of their species. Zethkaran's multifaceted eyes narrowed to slits of reflected starlight. The inheritors, Lyrithis and Nyxandra, to use their assumed human names, were the last survivors of the architect race, beings whose mastery of the source had once made them the undisputed rulers of known space. Their exile to Earth had been meant as a death sentence, marooning them on a primitive world where their powers would gradually fade without the cosmic energies that sustained their kind. Instead, it seemed, they had found a way to pass their abilities to humanity. This changes everything, announced Fleet Commander Kuldiran, his voice tight with controlled panic. If humans develop source capabilities, they could pose a threat to hegemony expansion protocols. Worse, they could serve as a rallying point for the remaining free worlds. Precisely, Zethkaran replied. Which is why Earth must be sterilized before this infection can spread. The tactical display shifted, showing Earth in three-dimensional detail. The blue-green world hung in space like a jewel, its surface teeming with nearly 10 billion human lives. From the hegemony's perspective, it was simply another obstacle to be removed. The cleansing fleet is already en route, reported Strategic Coordinator Havenhess. 700 dreadnoughts, each equipped with dimensional compression weapons. Estimated time to complete planetary sterilization? 4 standard hours. 4 hours to murder a world. Zethkaran studied the display with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. And the inheritors? Presumed to be sheltering somewhere in the target zone, Vestarian replied. Their power signatures are difficult to track since the confrontation. It's as if they've learned to mask their presence using human neural patterns. Then we will burn everything, Zethkaran decided. Leave nothing alive to hide behind. The War Council dissolved in a shimmer of teleported light, each officer returning to their vessels to oversee humanity's extermination. Only Zethkaran remained, studying Earth's image with eyes that had witnessed the death of 100 species. He did not see the single human ship that detached itself from his flagship's shadow, its pilot already racing toward Earth with news that would either save or damn the human race. David Kowalski woke up in a hospital bed that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The room around him was a testament to medical technology that bordered on miraculous walls that monitored his vital signs through simple proximity, air that carried trace pharmaceuticals designed to accelerate healing, gravity panels that could adjust local physics to reduce stress on damaged tissue. Everything was clean, efficient, and completely alien to someone who had spent the last 8 years living in the Undercity's squalor. You're awake, a voice said from the room's entrance. Good, we need to talk. David turned his head, ignoring the sharp pain that flared through his skull. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 45. Her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested military discipline despite her civilian clothes. Her eyes held the particular brand of weariness that came from carrying secrets too heavy for any one person to bear. Director Catherine Vale, she said, approaching his bed with the controlled movements of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. Terran Intelligence Division. Never heard of it, David said, his voice hoarse from dehydration. Most people haven't. We specialize in threats that officially don't exist. Vale pulled up a chair and sat down with the careful grace of someone who had learned not to make sudden movements around traumatized soldiers, like alien infiltrators and humans who can channel exotic energies without technological assistance. The memories came flooding back. The attack, the aliens, the impossible power that had flowed through his body like liquid fire. David sat up despite his injuries, suddenly aware that the comfortable hospital room might be as much prison as sanctuary. Where are they? He demanded. The girls Lyrithis and Nyxandra. Where are they? Safe, Vale replied. For now, though that status may be subject to change depending on how this conversation goes. David studied the intelligence director's face, looking for tells that might indicate deception. He found none, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. What do you want? To understand what happened in that building. To learn why a former TDC officer with no genetic modifications and no cybernetic enhancements was able to manifest enough energy to level a city block. Vale leaned forward slightly, and to figure out how to use that knowledge to keep humanity alive for the next 72 hours. 72 hours? That's when the alien fleet arrives to sterilize Earth. Vale's tone remained conversational, as though she were discussing the weather rather than the extinction of their entire species. 700 ships, each one capable of cracking a planet. They call it the cleansing fleet. And they're coming to make sure that whatever happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. David felt the power stirring in his chest again. Not the explosive force of his earlier rage, but something deeper and more controlled. Then we stopped them. We? Vale raised an eyebrow. Mr. Kowalski, you're a soup kitchen operator who until yesterday had never demonstrated any unusual abilities. The enemy is a galactic empire that has conquered thousands of worlds. What exactly do you propose we do? Before David could answer, the room's lights dimmed and the air itself seemed to thicken with potential energy. Lyrathus materialized from empty space, her alien form now clothed in what appeared to be living light. Behind her came Nexandra, the younger inheritor's golden radiance providing a counterpoint to her sister's stellar fire. We teach him, Lyrathus said simply. We show humanity what it has always had the potential to become. Vale's hand moved to the weapon holstered beneath her jacket, but froze when she felt the warm pressure of David's power wrapping around her like invisible chains. Not threatening, protective, warning the aliens that any aggressive action toward the intelligence director would not be tolerated. You can't transform an entire species in 3 days, Vale said, though her voice carried a note of desperate hope. No, Nexandra agreed, speaking for the first time since their transformation. Her voice was younger than her sister's, but carried the same harmonics of controlled power. But we can teach some, and those some can teach others. Humans have something that no other species we've encountered possesses. The ability to adapt their consciousness through pure willpower. What she's saying, David said, beginning to understand, is that we can evolve. Not over generations, but right now, today, when we need it most. Vale looked between the three of them, human and alien united in a way that should have been impossible. Even if that's true, even if some humans can develop these abilities, we're talking about facing down a fleet that could turn our sun into a black hole. How many people could we possibly train in 72 hours? 100? 1,000? That's the beautiful part, Lyrathus said, her ancient features brightening with something that might have been hope. You don't need to train an entire army. You just need to train the right people. Leaders who can inspire others. Protectors who will stand between the innocent and the dark. Humans who understand that some things are worth dying for. David stood up from the hospital bed, ignoring the medical sensors that began chiming in alarm as they detected his elevated bio readings. The power in his chest was growing stronger by the moment, fed by a determination that seemed to draw energy from the fundamental forces of the universe. How do we start? He asked. The transformation began in the Undercity where it all started. David returned to his soup kitchen to find it crowded with more people than it had ever held before. Word had spread through the underground networks that carried news faster than official channels. Something had happened in New Shanghai, something that had made the corporate overlords nervous, and the government issue carefully worded denials. The crowd that greeted him was different from his usual clientele. These weren't just the hungry and the desperate, though those were certainly present. These were people who had heard rumors of impossible things and come seeking answers. Veterans who recognized the look in David's eyes. Scientists who had detected energy readings that violated known physics. Parents who sensed that the world was about to change and wanted their children to be ready. Friends, David said, his voice carrying clearly despite the crowd's murmur. I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. He told them about the aliens, about the hegemony and their fleet of world killers, about 2 refugee children who had turned out to be the last survivors of a species that could teach humanity to touch the stars themselves. 3 days, he concluded. That's what we have to learn everything we can and spread it to everyone we can reach. Not enough time to save everyone, but maybe enough to save the species. A woman in the back of the crowd spoke up. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a physicist who had been blacklisted for publishing papers on exotic energy manipulation. Assuming this is all true, what exactly are you asking us to do? David looked around the room, seeing faces marked by skepticism, hope, fear, and desperate curiosity. These were his people. The forgotten ones, the failures, the rebels who refused to accept that the world had to be the way it was. I'm asking you to evolve, he said simply. Over the next 6 hours, David and the two inheritors conducted the most important classroom sessions in human history. They taught volunteers to recognize the source, the fundamental energy that connected all matter and consciousness across the universe. They showed them how to open their minds to possibilities that mainstream science insisted were impossible. Most failed. The human brain, it seemed, was remarkably resistant to change even when survival depended on it. But some, perhaps 1 in 50, managed to achieve basic energy manipulation. Simple tricks like generating light or creating small force barriers, barely enough to power a flashlight. But proof that the impossible was merely improbable. A few, perhaps 1 in 500, achieved true breakthrough. Lisa Chen, a former military engineer, learned to strengthen molecular bonds, turning ordinary materials into substances stronger than diamond. James Washington, a street medic who had kept half the Undercity alive with stolen supplies and improvised techniques, discovered he could accelerate biological healing through touch. Maria Santos, a teacher who had continued holding classes in abandoned buildings even after the education system collapsed, found she could share knowledge directly from mind to mind. And then there was David himself. As the hours passed and his understanding deepened, the power flowing through him grew beyond anything the inheritors had expected. He learned to reshape matter at the atomic level, to perceive the quantum fluctuations that gave rise to reality itself, to touch the cosmic energies that bound galaxies together. By the end of the first day, his abilities rivaled those of beings who had spent millennia mastering the source. This is unprecedented, Laurithis confided to her sister as they watched David demonstrate gravitational manipulation to a group of wide-eyed volunteers. His progression rate exceeds our most optimistic projections by several orders of magnitude. It's not just him, Noxandra replied. Look at the others. Each breakthrough seems to catalyze the next. They're learning from each other in ways we never anticipated. It was true. The humans with newly awakened abilities were teaching each other, sharing insights and techniques with the same generous spirit that had led David to feed hungry children. The knowledge spread like wildfire, jumping from person to person in chains of inspiration that defied traditional learning models. By the second day, they had trained nearly 3,000 people to some degree of source manipulation. By the third day, that number had grown to 30,000 as the awakened humans fanned out across the globe, seeking others who might have the potential for rapid evolution. It wasn't nearly enough to face down a fleet of 700 dreadnoughts, but it was a start. The real breakthrough came when Maria Santos, the teacher turned telepath, made a discovery that changed everything. It's not individual power that matters, she announced to the assembled group on the morning of the third day. It's collective consciousness. When we link our abilities together, the combined effect is exponential rather than additive. She demonstrated by connecting with 5 other awakened humans, their combined telepathic abilities creating a network of shared thought and purpose. Together, they generated an energy field that dwarfed anything any individual had achieved. Gestalt consciousness, Laerithis breathed, her alien features brightening with recognition. It's how the architects first learned to touch the source millennia ago. But we required technological amplification to achieve stable links. These humans are doing it through pure mental discipline. David felt the network calling to him, thousands of minds touching the edges of his consciousness with tentative curiosity. When he opened himself to the connection, the sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was still himself, still David Kowalski, former soldier turned soup kitchen operator. But he was also part of something larger, a collective human consciousness awakening to its own vast potential. Through the network, he could feel awakened humans around the globe. Scientists in Geneva who were learning to manipulate time itself. Artists in Tokyo who painted with light pulled from distant stars. Children in São Paulo who played games that rewrote local physics. Grandmothers in Cairo who told stories that made their listeners see through dimensions beyond the normal three. Humanity was evolving. Not through genetic manipulation or technological augmentation, but through the simple recognition that consciousness itself was the fundamental force of the universe. And just in time. The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace exactly 72 hours after David's first encounter with Vestarian. 700 dreadnoughts arranged themselves in a perfect sphere around Earth, their weapons already charging for the bombardment that would reduce humanity's homeworld to component atoms. High Admiral Zeth Karen stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching Earth turn beneath him like a blue-white jewel waiting to be shattered. His multifaceted eyes reflected the planet's image with clinical satisfaction. In 4 hours, this system would contain nothing but dust and radiation. The human infection would be cauterized before it could spread. That was when the first impossibility manifested. A barrier of pure energy materialized around Earth. Not a defensive screen projected by orbital platforms, but something generated from the planet's surface itself. The barrier pulsed with harmonics that made Zeth Karen's enhanced senses recoil in surprise. It carried the resonance signature of source manipulation, but at a scale that should have required the combined output of a dozen Architect-class entities. Admiral, his tactical coordinator, reported, voice tight with controlled panic. We're detecting massive energy emissions from approximately 30,000 locations across the planetary surface. The readings are inconsistent with our intelligence regarding human capabilities. Zeth Karen's expression darkened. Fire, he commanded. The first wave of dimensional compression weapons struck the barrier with enough force to shatter continents. The energy simply absorbed the attacks, distributing the impact across quantum probability fields that treated physics like gentle suggestions rather than immutable laws. Impossible, Zeth Karen hissed. No species develops defensive capabilities of this magnitude in mere days. Even the architects required millennia to achieve stable planetary protection. His answer came from an unexpected source. A human voice somehow transmitted directly into every hegemony vessel simultaneously, speaking in perfect harmonic language despite the biological impossibility of human vocal cords producing such sounds. Admiral Zeth Karen. David Kowalski's voice carried undertones of power that made the flagship's hull plates vibrate in sympathy. My name is David. We need to talk. The meeting took place in neutral space, a pocket dimension created by the combined will of 30,000 awakened humans. Their consciousness stretched across light years to forge a conference room from pure thought and starlight. David materialized first, his human form clothed in energies that made the vacuum itself sing with harmonious vibrations. He was still recognizably the man who had served soup to hungry children, but the power flowing through him had transformed him into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Around him floated representations of Earth's awakened population, teachers and soldiers, scientists and artists, children and grandparents, all linked in a network of shared purpose that hummed with barely contained potential. High Admiral Zeth Karen appeared a moment later, his void-black form wreathed in the dark energies that marked his mastery over entropy itself. Behind him came the senior officers of the hegemony fleet, each one a living weapon capable of reshaping reality according to their empire's vision of ordered perfection. The two groups faced each other across the infinite expanse of the neutral space, representatives of philosophies so fundamentally opposed that peaceful coexistence should have been impossible. You requested this meeting, Zeth Karen said, his words carrying undertones that could shatter molecular bonds. Speak, before I lose patience with this charade. David studied the alien admiral with eyes that could perceive the quantum fluctuations underlying his enhanced form. What he saw there surprised him, not the cold malevolence he had expected, but something far more dangerous, genuine conviction. Zeth Karen truly believed that the hegemony's path was the only way to bring order to a chaotic universe. We want to make you an offer, David said simply. You are in no position to negotiate, Zeth Karen replied. Your species has achieved impressive defensive capabilities, but defense alone cannot win wars. We have 700 dreadnoughts. You have one world. The mathematics are simple. Are they? David gestured, and the space around them filled with images, not holographic projections, but actual windows into distant realities. Look closer, Admiral. The first window showed a hegemony mining colony in the Vega system. The facility that had operated for 3 centuries was now dark, its automated systems failing as the enslaved population discovered they could manipulate the source energies that powered their restraints. Workers who had been treated as disposable resources for generations were standing up, casting off their chains, and demanding to be treated as sentient beings with inherent rights. The second window displayed a different scene, a hegemony research station orbiting a neutron star. The scientists there, members of a species that had been conquered 2 millennia ago, were experiencing spontaneous consciousness expansion. Their newfound abilities allowed them to perceive the cruelty inherent in their assigned research projects designed to develop ever more efficient methods of planetary sterilization. Window after window revealed the same pattern. Across the hegemony's vast empire, beings were awakening to possibilities their conquerors had tried to suppress. The network of human consciousness that connected Earth's awakened population had somehow reached across interstellar distances, touching minds that had forgotten what it meant to dream of freedom. "This is impossible," Fleet Commander Kaldarin whispered, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the images of rebellion spreading like wildfire through hegemony space. Consciousness cannot propagate across galactic distances without technological amplification. The energy requirements alone would require more power than any single species could generate, David agreed. But we're not a single species anymore. Every mind that awakens to its true potential becomes part of the network. Every being that remembers what freedom feels like strengthens the connection. Your own subjects are teaching us how to reach others. Zithkaran's form began to pulse with barely contained rage. You dare to corrupt the order we have spent millennia establishing. We dare to remind the universe what it was like before your kind decided that diversity was a disease to be cured. David's voice carried harmonics that made the pocket dimension itself resonate with sympathetic energy. Tell me, Admiral, when did the hegemony last create something beautiful? When did your people write poetry, compose music, or tell stories that weren't propaganda? Art is chaos, Zekarin spat. Beauty is inefficiency. We offer purpose, stability, unity of thought and deed. You offer death, David replied. The slow, grinding death of everything that makes existence worth living. The alien admiral raised his hand, dark energy crackling between his fingers with enough force to unmake galaxies. Then you choose extinction over enlightenment. So be it. But before he could strike, another voice cut through the tension, young, clear, and carrying harmonics that made even Zethakaran pause in recognition. Uncle Nixanger said, stepping forward from the group of human consciousness representatives, "Why are you so afraid?" The word hit Zethkaran like a physical blow. "Impossible," he breathed. Nick Sandra died with the rest of the architects. The cleansing fires consumed Architect Prime. No one survived. 3 survived, Lyritha said, joining her sister. And we remember everything, including what the hegemony was like before it chose conquest over growth. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled hegemony officers. The architects were legendary among their kind, beings of such power and wisdom that even the hegemony's earliest founders had looked to them for guidance. The official history claimed they had destroyed themselves in a civil war, leaving behind only ruins and scattered technological artifacts. "You were there?" Lyrithus continued, addressing Zithakaran directly. "On the Council of Synthesis, you voted with us to pursue the path of guided evolution rather than forcible unification. You believed once that diversity was strength rather than weakness." Zethkaran's form began to flicker, the dark energies that sustained his enhanced biology responding to the emotional turmoil hidden beneath his calculated exterior. The architects fell because they refused to accept necessity. The universe is chaos. Only through absolute order can peace be achieved. "Is this peace?" David asked, gesturing to the images still floating around them. Worlds stripped of resources, populations reduced to slave labor, entire civilizations extinguished because they refused to conform to hegemony standards. Or is this just the silence that comes after everything worth saving has been destroyed? For the first time in centuries, Zethkaran looked uncertain. The doubt that flickered behind his multifaceted eyes was visible for only an instant. But David's enhanced perceptions caught it. Somewhere beneath the layers of bioengineered enhancement and ideological conditioning, the being who had once voted for evolution over extinction still existed. Even if what you say is true, Zefkaran said slowly, it changes nothing. The hegemony fleet follows my orders. 700 ships, each crewed by beings who have known nothing but our way of life for generations. They will fire on your world whether I command it or not. Then give them a different choice, David said. He opened his mind to the network, drawing on the collective consciousness of 30,000 awakened humans. The power that flowed through him in that moment was beyond anything the hegemony had ever encountered. Not the rigid control that their technology imposed, but the chaotic beauty of unrestrained creativity guided by shared purpose. The pocket dimension expanded, encompassing the entire hegemony fleet. Every crew member, from the lowliest technician to the highest-ranking officer, found themselves connected to the network of human consciousness. For the first time in their lives, they experienced thoughts and emotions that weren't filtered through hegemony ideology. They felt David's memories of serving soup to hungry children, the simple joy of giving without expectation of reward. They shared Lisa Chen's determination to protect the weak, even when it meant standing against overwhelming odds. They touched Maria Santos' love of knowledge for its own sake, the wonder of learning something new just for the joy of understanding. Most importantly, they felt what it was like to be free. Not the absence of restraint, but the presence of choice. The ability to decide for themselves what kind of beings they wanted to be, what kind of universe they wanted to live in. The effect was immediate and transformational. Across 700 ships, beings who had never questioned orders began to ask why those orders existed. Crew members who had accepted suffering as natural law began to imagine alternatives. Species that had been conquered so long ago they had forgotten their own names started to remember who they had been before the hegemony found them. Within minutes, the fleet was in chaos. Not the violent disorder that Sekaran feared, but the beautiful complexity of millions of individual minds awakening to their own potential. Some ships broke formation, their crews declaring independence from hegemony control. Others maintained discipline, but opened channels of communication with Earth, asking questions about human philosophy and the nature of the network that had touched their thoughts. A few vessels remained loyal to their original mission, their crews too deeply conditioned to embrace change. But even among those ships, doubt had taken root. The certainty that had once driven the hegemony's expansion was crumbling like a structure built on foundations of sand. Zethakaran watched his fleet dissolve around him with something approaching fascination. "This is what you offer the universe?" he asked David. "Chaos masquerading as enlightenment? This is what we offer the universe," David replied, and his voice carried the harmonics of every awakened human, every liberated slave, every being who had chosen freedom over security. The chance to become something better than what we were. The Admiral's form began to change. The dark energies that had enhanced his biology for centuries were fading, revealing the being he had been before the hegemony's biotechnology transformed him into a living weapon. His skin lightened from void black to the deep blue that marked his species' natural coloration. The geometric patterns of power etched into his flesh softened into something that might once have been beautiful. "I remember," he said quietly. "Before the great synthesis, before we decided that the universe needed to be corrected, we had art, music, philosophy that wasn't propaganda." He looked up at David with eyes that reflected stars instead of emptiness. "What have we become?" "What you chose to become," Lyrathis said gently. "But choice works both ways. You can choose to become something else." Zethkiran nodded slowly, then turned to address what remained of his fleet. When he spoke, his voice carried new harmonics, not the rigid authority of military command, but the uncertain hope of someone taking their first steps toward redemption. "Stand down," he ordered. "All vessels, stand down. The cleansing is cancelled." The peace negotiations took place on Earth itself in the ruins of David's old soup kitchen. It was, David reflected, perhaps the most unlikely setting for interstellar diplomacy in human history. The building was still partially collapsed from the hegemony's initial assault, its walls held together by determination and emergency scaffolding. But it was also where everything had begun, where two hungry alien children had received their first taste of human compassion, and where a former soldier had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was an open hand rather than a closed fist. The representatives who gathered there came from dozens of species, many of whom were experiencing freedom for the first time in centuries. Former hegemony slave soldiers sat beside human teachers, sharing stories of worlds they had known before conquest. Scientists who had spent their lives developing weapons of mass destruction worked alongside artists who were relearning what it meant to create rather than destroy. Zeth-Karan himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation. Stripped of his biotechnological enhancements, he appeared much as he had before the hegemony's rise to power. A being of obvious intelligence and unexpected grace, his blue-skinned features marked by something that might have been called kindness in a human context. "The question," he said during one of the early sessions, "is what comes next." The hegemony controlled 17,000 star systems. Even with the fleet's defection, many of those worlds remain under the authority of beings who have never known alternatives to our way of governance. "Then we show them," David replied. He was sitting in the same chair he had occupied for 8 years, ladling soup for whoever needed it. The fact that he could now manipulate matter at the quantum level seemed somehow secondary to the simple human act of making sure no one went hungry. "The same way we showed your fleet crews, not through force or coercion, but through example. And if they refused to listen?" David considered the question with the gravity it deserved. The awakened humans had demonstrated they could defend themselves, but defense was different from conquest. The temptation to use their new abilities to impose their values on others was strong and dangerous. The line between liberation and tyranny could be thinner than most people wanted to admit. "Then we protect those who need protection and leave the door open for those who want to change," he said finally. "Freedom has to be chosen, not imposed." Over the following weeks, the framework for what would become known as the Synthesis Accords took shape. The hegemony's authoritarian structure would be dismantled gradually, with local populations given the support they needed to develop their own forms of governance. Species that had been enslaved for millennia would receive assistance in rebuilding their cultures and reclaiming their homeworlds. Most importantly, the network of awakened consciousness would remain open to any being who wished to join it. But participation would be entirely voluntary. It wasn't perfect. No peace treaty ever was. There were still hegemony holdouts who refused to accept the new reality, and some newly liberated worlds struggled with the responsibilities that came with freedom. But it was a beginning. The first time in galactic history that a major conflict had been resolved through expansion of consciousness rather than application of superior firepower. The signing ceremony took place at sunset, with Earth's star painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present of the beauty worth preserving. David signed as humanity's representative, his name written in letters that seemed to contain entire galaxies in miniature. Zeth-Karan signed for the former hegemony territories, his signature flowing like liquid starlight across the quantum crystalline document that would be felt across 17,000 worlds simultaneously. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Lyrothis and Nix Andra added their marks to the accord. As the last surviving architects, their participation represented something unprecedented in galactic politics. Beings choosing to share power rather than hoard it, wisdom offered freely rather than hoarded like treasure. "This is not an ending," Lyrothis said as the ceremony concluded. "It is a beginning. For the first time in millennia, the universe is free to become whatever its inhabitants choose to make of it." David looked around at the gathering humans and aliens working together to build something that had never existed before. A galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. It wasn't the world he had imagined when he first started serving soup to hungry children. It was something far better. The luxury starship that appeared at David's door was unlike anything ever built by human or alien hands. It was, first and foremost, beautiful. Where human vessels were built for efficiency and alien ships had historically been designed for intimidation, this craft seemed to have been created by beings who understood that form and function could dance together in perfect harmony. Its hull flowed like liquid silver, marked with patterns that shifted between colors that had no names in any known language. Energy fields surrounded it like aurora made solid, painting the air with lights that made everyone who saw them smile without quite understanding why. David emerged from his home, no longer a collapsing building in the Undercity, but a comfortable house overlooking New Shanghai's newly cleaned harbor, and found himself face to face with two young women who had become legends throughout the galaxy. Lyrathis and Nixandra still appeared essentially human, but 10 years of freedom had transformed them in subtle ways. They moved with the confidence of beings who had helped reshape galactic civilization, but their eyes still held the warmth David remembered from that first morning when they had smiled over bowls of soup. "Hello, David," Lyrathis said. "We came to keep a promise." "What promise?" Nixandra grinned, and for a moment she looked exactly like the 8-year-old orphan she had pretended to be. "That we'd show you the universe properly. You've seen it through the network, but that's not the same as visiting in person." The ship's interior was even more remarkable than its exterior. The walls were alive not in the biological sense but in the sense that they responded to the emotions and desires of their passengers. When David thought about the soup kitchen, he found himself standing in a perfect recreation of the original building, complete with the familiar smells of cooking food and the comfortable chaos of feeding hungry people. "The ship's consciousness is a gestalt entity," Lyrathis explained as they settled into chairs that adjusted themselves to provide perfect comfort, created from the combined memories of everyone who contributed to its construction. Humans, former hegemony species, even some of the artificial intelligences that have achieved awakening over the past decade. "It's beautiful," David said, and meant it. Through the ship's transparent walls he could see Earth falling away beneath them, his homeworld now glowing with energies that spoke of a population learning to touch the stars themselves. Their first destination was Zethikaran's homeworld, a planet that had once been the administrative center for the hegemony's authoritarian regime and was now the site of one of the galaxy's most ambitious rehabilitation projects. Former slave soldiers were working alongside their former victims to build a society based on the radical premise that all sentient beings deserve dignity and freedom. The former admiral met them at the spaceport, his appearance so changed from their first encounter that David almost didn't recognize him. The centuries of biotechnological enhancement had been replaced by something far more profound, the simple contentment of someone who had found meaningful work in service to others. He was teaching former hegemony officers how to integrate into civilian society, helping them overcome the conditioning that had turned them into instruments of oppression. "David," he said, embracing the human with the warmth of an old friend. "Welcome to what your species calls a miracle." They spent 3 days on the world, witnessing the slow but steady transformation of a society learning to value creativity over conformity. David watched former enforcers learning to paint, scientists discovering the joy of research conducted for curiosity rather than military application, administrators finding satisfaction in solving problems through cooperation rather than coercion. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was hopeful in a way that made David remember why he had started serving soup to hungry children in the first place. Their journey continued across the galaxy, visiting worlds that had been touched by the wave of consciousness expansion that began in a collapsed soup kitchen. On some planets, the changes were dramatic. Former totalitarian regimes replaced by participatory democracies that took into account the needs of every citizen. On others, the transformation was more subtle, art becoming more expressive, music growing more complex, children learning to dream of futures that their parents had never imagined possible. Everywhere they went, David saw the same pattern. Beings who had been given the chance to choose their own paths were becoming something greater than what they had been, not through force or genetic manipulation but through the simple recognition that consciousness itself was the most powerful force in the universe. The final stop on their tour was perhaps the most significant, the world that had once been Architect Prime, homeworld of the species that had guided galactic civilization for millions of years before the hegemony's rise to power. The planet was being rebuilt by volunteers from across known space, its cities rising again in forms that blended the architectural knowledge of a dozen species with design principles that existed nowhere but in the dreams of awakened consciousness. Where the old architect cities had been monuments to power and knowledge hoarded, the new constructions were celebrations of wisdom shared freely. "We're not trying to recreate what was," Lyrathis explained as they walked through the construction site that would one day become the galaxy's first truly integrated university. "We're building something that never existed before. A place where any being can come to learn, to teach, to grow in whatever direction their nature calls them toward." David nodded, understanding. The old galaxy was gone. the rigid hierarchies, the forced conformity, the assumption that some beings were naturally suited to rule while others were meant to serve. In its place was something messier, more chaotic, infinitely more alive. As they prepared to return to Earth, David found himself standing on a balcony that overlooked the reconstruction site. The sun was setting, painting the alien sky in colors that had no human names, and for a moment he felt the same sense of peace he had experienced while serving soup to hungry children. "Regrets?" Nick Sandra asked, joining him at the railing. David considered the question seriously. His old life had been simple, predictable, contained within the comfortable boundaries of a single building in a single city on a single world. His new life was vast, complex, filled with responsibilities that spanned galaxies and friendships that crossed species lines. "No," he said finally. "No regrets at all." The starship that carried them back to Earth was filled with representatives from hundreds of worlds, beings who had come to participate in the ongoing experiment in galactic civilization. Some were returning students, some were teachers, some were simply travelers who had heard that Earth was the place where impossible things became possible. As they approached his homeworld, David could see the changes that 10 years had wrought. The poisoned skies had been cleaned. The mega-cities transformed into communities that balanced efficiency with beauty. Most importantly, the Undercity where he had spent 8 years ladling soup had been rebuilt as a memorial and learning center, a place where beings from across the galaxy could come to understand how small acts of kindness could reshape the universe. The ship settled onto the landing pad with the grace of a falling leaf, its hull singing harmonics that made everyone within a mile radius feel for just a moment the joy of coming home. David stepped onto the familiar soil of his homeworld and found himself surrounded by faces both alien and human, students he had taught, former hegemony officers he had helped find redemption, children who had been born into a universe where the impossible was just another word for not yet understood. "Welcome home," said a voice from the crowd. And David realized that he was looking at the first generation of naturally awakened humans, children who had been born with the ability to touch the network of consciousness, to perceive the connections that bound all living things together. They were beautiful, these children of a new age, not because they possessed extraordinary abilities, but because they had never known a universe where diversity was considered a weakness, or where cooperation was seen as impossible. "Thank you," David said, addressing not just the crowd but the universe itself, "for letting me be part of this." As the celebration continued around him, humans and aliens sharing food, music, and stories under stars that no longer seemed impossibly distant. David remembered something Lyrithus had told him during their first conversation about the nature of power. "The greatest strength," she had said, "is not the ability to impose your will upon others. It is the wisdom to help others discover their own will, and the courage to step aside when they find it." David Kowalski had spent his life learning the truth of those words, first as a soldier who had refused to follow illegal orders, then as a soup kitchen operator who had fed hungry children without expectation of reward, and finally as a teacher who had helped an entire galaxy remember what it meant to be free. The universe was vast, filled with wonders that no single species could ever hope to understand alone, but it was also, David had learned, filled with beings who were willing to share their bowls of soup with strangers, and sometimes that was enough to change everything.